5. So this chapter kind of may be boring to talk about, but what we can see very clearly is related to something we talked about, the difference between the first chapter and the next 3 chapters, if we can see the next 3 chapters as one story. Which is that the first chapter has a very clear structure. We don't need to speculate to find the structure, how that begins, how it's divided, because it has the 7-day structure. The next 2 chapters very clearly don't have a structure, and I think very clearly are not meant to be read in a linear exact structure, and therefore how to even cut it up and how to make sense of what's first and what's next is not so simple, although the meaning of both of these might not be literally in the structure. The meaning, these are just ways of organizing something, and also structures are ways of understanding, because in some sense all understanding is structuring, like we discussed in the first chapter. But these are different ways to get to the understanding. One is through a very clear structure, and the other one is through a story. Everyone can see that the story in chapter 2 is, so to speak, much more developed. There's a lot more character, there's a lot more going on, although like the rest of the Tanakh, it's not developed at length like in a modern novel or something, but you can see there's some character, there's some stuff going on, and that gives us what to hang on, what to begin to understand from. Versus the first chapter and what's known as a certain style of chapters in Tanakh, which is it gets its understanding or gets its logic from this structure. So now that we're in chapter 5, we can see very clearly that this chapter is, again, very clearly a structured chapter. And it seems like it gets a lot of its logic, and if we want to understand it, we need to read it in that structure and then maybe notice the minute differences or notice where there is something that goes out of the simple level of the structure and says something. So that's the chapter which has its own heading, and maybe this heading for the whole book. Maybe it's a heading for this story until the story of Noach, until Ella told us Noach. If we divide Breishis into the headings which have Ella told us, these are the Toledot, which might mean literally children, but maybe also mean something like stories. Zeh Sefer not necessarily means this is the book. In modern Hebrew and in Rabbinic Hebrew, Sefer almost always means a book. It can mean also like something like a document. It doesn't have to be necessarily like a book. It can mean a document. But in here, it's not necessarily not clear. It's possible that it means something like an account. Account is a good word because it has the root account in it, and we also in English have an account, or we recount a story, and counting, which is counting numbers, are similar. And it's interesting that the one chapter in the Chumash that has its explicit title as Zeh Sefer, this is a book, is also really a count. It's a count of generations. It's an account working by account. So that connects with what we just said, that this is a way of making sense of things which works very much on finding a certain order and a certain structure. And there's a lot of numbers. And again, for us, numbers are boring, but it's not necessarily so to everyone, to the kind of people who this chapter is for. And there are, until this day, people who have a lot of life. They love numbers. And for the kind of understanding of this kind of chapters for, it seems like the numbers are actually something that have a lot of clarity, and you could see yourself. Numbers are something that have a lot of clarity. They're discrete. They're a certain specific amount, not more, not less, and it's a certain way of understanding. This also brings me to a comment which is important to me, although maybe not for everyone, but I will say it. Just like we understand that when we have a chapter that is very much focused on giving you a story. Now, stories, everyone knows stories have rules. What makes a story a good story? And the biblical stories also, the chapters that are focused on stories, we have law chapters, we have, like we have here, lists of genealogical list chapters and dating chapters, which don't have that kind of story logic. But chapters that have a story logic, everyone understands that stories have their ways. If you go to storytelling class, they teach you how, or basically read ancient books on rhetoric or on poetics. They describe how good stories are built, and there are certain rules for good stories are built. And therefore we understand also that is not the same thing as giving what we, in a certain sense, would call an accurate historical account. Like even modern history, in certain ways, we have this expectation, although it's never entirely true, of like something to be true, to be like literally accurate or literally true. And everyone that understands the logic of stories knows that since the kind of understanding or the kind of convincing or the kind of clarity that a story gives you has its rules, has its ways, so we're always going to exaggerate certain things or emphasize certain things in order for the story to work, although that is already putting some framework, some larger way of understanding upon the reality. We never have like the raw data of reality wouldn't be understandable to us. It wouldn't be a story. And therefore, every kind of chapter that we read, we have to notice what kind of structure, what kind of understanding is it imposing on the raw data, like the toy of reality. And if we understand the rules of that logic, we could also understand why it's there. And the answer is not always necessarily, or maybe never necessarily, just because that's how it happened. Because maybe if the story happened in exactly that way or not is not the important thing. Because when you tell a story, you're telling it in a certain way in order to get a certain point out of it, or in order to make you understand something in a certain storytelling way. And this is also how we can reconcile many disagreements, many contradictions that we find between different versions of stories, because each time someone tells a story, he has maybe a different goal or a different context or a different idea in mind. Okay. Now, just like we understand that, I think this is something that many people understand. And just like we understand that, the same way we have to understand that there's a different logic, just like there's like this, like we could call it like a very lively way of making stories fun and exciting with character development and with conflict and with resolution and all of that. There's also a different kind of understanding, which is based on cutting things up in a very clear way, putting numbers to things, giving counts of generations and things like that. But that is also a way of imposing order on a more messy raw data reality. And therefore, one thing we should notice is that when there's chapters of numbers and lists, that also does not mean necessarily that the list is there just because it's like a factual accounting of what happened. Even if it is actually what happened, the reason why we have these lists is not just to tell us what happened, is to gain a certain kind of understanding, which is the kind of understanding in the list. And everyone knows, even when we do math, even modern science, which is a scientific, mathematical way of cutting up reality, that doesn't mean that that's all there is to reality. It doesn't mean that that's just the simplest way to present the raw data of reality. It's just a certain way of understanding, and it has its own, what we call doichkim. It has its own things that it imposes on the reality and causes it, and has its own logic of how to present itself in a certain way. This is contrary to what most people would think, that if there's a list of dates and numbers, that the only reason there could be such a list would be just because that's how it happened, and then it seems to them very far-fetched if someone says that this is maybe a list that's a mythical list, or it's a list that has some purpose besides for just telling us how many years exactly each of these generations lived. Now, I don't know what the exact purpose of these lists is, but let's go through the list. Now let's go through seeing what we have. So what we have here is very clearly this chapter, and it's very, I think whoever divided the chapters did the correct job in cutting it up in the exact correct way. And really the Parshas more or less agree, except that in the end they continue further into the beginning of the 6th chapter, and I think there's a reason for that also. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But more or less, this is a list, and it's known in the Mishnah as the list of the 10 generations from Adam until Noach. So, of course, the important thing that this list does is it gives us a bridge between the two first important characters of the story. There's Adam, who has long stories about him, and his children, which is like also about him. Of course, we'll see Noach's children also have stories, so there's a clear correspondence between these two things. But then there's like a long time in between, and that long in between is filled in by this list of 10 generations, and it's pretty clear that most of the generations, at least, are not really interesting for themselves. We don't really care about what happened to them. Of course, there were people, they were born, they were died, they worked. There was probably all kind of dramas and all kind of stories, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the people in the beginning and at the end of the list. And everyone else is there just to connect the list, because there seems to be, maybe there's a logic of like completism. Like some people, of course, later try to count which year exactly we are from creation based on these lists. I'm not sure that that's what these lists are for, but they're definitely for creating a continuous narrative all the way from beginning to end. Of course, we have the book Chronicles Divrei Yomim, which is literally just these lists without the years, but just the list of names and generations all the way from Adam until David, and really until Zerubbabel, until the times of the Second Temple. So this is what the list does. Now, another thing this list does, and I'm going to give you the general structure of it, is there's these 10 generations. For each generation, it does something, and this is the most complete version of such a list. There's, of course, another such list later between Noach and Avram, also to create the bridge between these two people. But that list, you'll notice, is a lot more restricted. It's a lot smaller. It has less details. There's a certain fullness that this list has that no other list in the Tanakh gets close to. There are other such lists, and all of them are shorter. What this list is, the most full ones, is it has something like this. It has the story of each generation until he had a child, or this specific child that it's talking about. They might have had different children. They explicitly had different children. It's not even clear to me that this child is meant to be the first child. It's the child that's relevant who creates the chain of generations. Number 2, it has his life after he gives birth to this child, to the next generation. And number 3, it has the total, the sum amount of years how he lived entirely and his death. And these seem to be important here because this is how it creates this chain of generations where there's step 1 where there's the father's generation, like for example Adam, he lives and has his own life. Then at some stage he stops living by himself. He gives birth to Shais, which is the next generation. So now they're living in parallel. There's, so to speak, 2 generations or 2 heads of generations of who these people seem to be. And they have a parallel life. And then there's a total of the both. Like when we talk about a person's life, we could talk about it really in 2 different stages or in 3 different ways. We could talk about his life before he gave birth, we talk about his life after he gave birth, and we talk about his life in general, in total, with just he was born and he died. But since there's something very important in the giving over of generation to generation here, of the passing the authority or passing of the whatever it is that the story is really about here, it's important for the pasuk to split it. And of course, this also allows us to calculate a total of years that have elapsed. If we know which age each person gave birth, we know also how to calculate a total amount of years for this whole period. That might be a reason why it gives us these years, but not going to help us for answering why then we have these very detailed list of how many years he lived after giving birth, and then the pasuk doing the math for us and saying, and the total was such and such. We could have done that math itself. So it only really needs one of these 2, and that's actually how the next list works. So this list seems to be important to show us this triple levels of a person's life, and you could think about it a lot, what it means in the context of each generation, and what it means especially here when it's like the establishment of the existence of generations. And that's one more thing I will say about these lists, which has these 10 names. Adam, Shais, Enosh, Kainan, Mahalalel, Yered, Chanoich, Mesustelach, Lemech, Noach. And we can imagine that each of these names, and this is the logic of genealogical lists very often, they're not just the first child or some name of the child that existed. They are also, maybe each of them had created, and sometimes we see, and this is a theory, sometimes we see there's families that are attributed, that call themselves on the name of a certain ancient ancestor. And sometimes there's families for each one. Like if we have, for example, the Avos, Avram, Yitzchok, Yaakov, we don't really have that. But there's some people that would say, like maybe there's Esav, which is only Yitzchok. And then there's Ishmael, which is only Avram. So there's some split-offs. So each generation there are people who are descendants of Ishmael would say we're children of Abraham, but we're not children of Yitzchok. And then there's next people who are children of both, and then there's children that are all 3. And there might be something similar where there were some group of people who said we're children of Shais, but they were not children of Enosh because they were born from a different child, and so on. But then the pasuk seems to have, it's like one list which leads to the one person it's interested in, which is Noach, who was the son of the son of the son of all these exact people. So that's the important thing, and that's why I think the most general construct of this list is that it starts from Adam. It has the beginning, and of course it has also a header that repeats again how man was created in the image of God, which is a slightly different word than we had before, Tselem. So we have Tselem, Tmis, might mean the same thing, might not mean the same thing. It talks about also again how they were born male and female, how they were blessed, how they were called Adam. All this seems to be a very short recap of the creation of man, and it seems to be important to be here because this is like the most short version. Before we put this over to the next generation, we need to know what a man is. And we have also very important, the first time Adam gave birth, it says Vayoled bid Musa Ketsalma. There's many midrashim and other things about what this means, why there isn't the same thing later. But importantly, we can read this in a simple sense, not as saying that later it wasn't like that, but as explicitly giving this. Because if the first man, if Adam was created bid Musa him, we understand that because God created him. But the second man was created by his father bid Musa him, but Salma bid Musa, which is another chiddush, which is a new thing. Now the end of the list leads all the way to the son of Lemech, who was Noach, maybe one of the younger people, not necessarily, to give birth. And it has something that we don't have in the first. Of course, there might be in a hidden way, in a not explicit way here, the reason why Adam is called Adam. It doesn't really say. We don't have that reason. We assume that it's because of Adam and Adam, which says in the previous story. But then the last name, all the other 9 names on this list don't have reasons for why they're called. Of course, Shais has a reason, but it's not in this story. And only when we get to the last one, it seems to be an important sign that this is what we're trying to get to with the whole list, which is that Lemech had a son called him Noach. Not just there was a guy Noach, he called him Noach. And there was a reason he called him Lemer, something like he said. And whenever, just a rule for the whole Torah, Lemer means quote, begin quote. This is the Rashban's Pshat, and I think that's always matches. There's never a time where it's or at least almost never a time that it doesn't work. Lemech means this was what he said. So Lemech is quoting Lemech. Lemech said, when as he's giving the name Noach, or like the reason why he's giving the name Noach is because he said, so this is going back to the circle of Adam. We have Adam, who was Min Adam, and then Cain, and both of them were cursed with the earth. And when the Lemech says, this one will be menachem us, or there's a question if it means the language of consolation, if it means consolation, or if it means something like will make us rest, because they had a lot of work, and Lech will make us rest, so Lashon Menucha instead of Lashon Nechama. In any case, what it means is either a blessing, or a prayer, or a promise, which I think is the most reasonable reading. And I think it's the Medrash reads it this way, and I think that the Psukim, when they say, when someone is born, they give a reason for his name. Very often it's a kind of prophecy, or it's a kind of prefiguration of what that person will be. Like we have a Yaakov and Esav and so on. So it's saying that Noach somehow will make us rest or console us from this cursed earth. Now, how does Noach do that exactly? That's another question that we have to find out in the end. But it seems probably this has to do with the fact that a big part of the story of Noach is not only that the Mabul created was in his time, but also that he saved us from the Mabul. And he also achieved some kind of promise from God that there won't be another Mabul. And that has to do with God's sort of ongoing anger about this, against this Adama, which the Mabul is just the most extreme instantiation of. And Noach stopped this. I think that's the most reasonable interpretation. So that's the story of Noach. Then we get the Noach's 3 children, and the next, and we'll talk about the next story next. The only other exception, and so that's the main thing of the story. There's one more exception from the regular rhythm of being born and giving birth and dying, which is Chanoich. Okay, Chanoich lived 65 years, had the Musa Shelach, and then there's a different language. It doesn't say Vaychi Chanoich, it says Vayishalech Chanoich Esu Alihim. Okay, so number one, his life, especially his life after giving birth to Musa Shelach. First, he lived just like everyone else. Then he had a different thing. He didn't live. He walked with God, or with the God, or with the gods, or if you want to read Ha'alihim. And what does that mean? We could see later in Parshas Noach, and then later by Avram, that Vishalach Es Alihim means a certain level of righteousness, or a certain level of walking with God, doing the correct thing, which apparently this is signifies that all the other people were not doing that. And then one more thing is then saying when he died, again, just like when he lived, or the second level he lived, when he lived along with Mr. Shelach, which is different than living himself, sort of like as a bachelor life and a married life. And when he lived Esu Alihim, he's Mishalech Esu Alihim, and when he died, it says again, Vayishalech Hanoch Esu Alihim, Vaynenu Kelukecha Esu Alihim. It doesn't say that he died, it says, but God took him. I don't think, of course, there's many Midrashim about this. I don't think the most literal sense of Lukecha Esu Alihim is just a word for dying, but it's a different word. There seems to be a difference between the righteous and the non-righteous. Maybe they're especially righteous, not just like a good person, but something special, which is both a difference in living, and it's also a difference in death. There's a death of someone who was Mishalech Esu Alihim, who was taken by God. Now, what this means is still somewhat of a mystery, but seems to be important in this story. Like, in other words, if we say that the purpose of this chapter like this is to say who is important and who is not, so everyone between Adam, of course Adam is important, but between Adam and Noach, nobody's important, besides for Chanoich, who is somewhat important. And another thing, of course, he lived much less than everyone else, and that might also mean the reasoning for Kelukecha Esu Alihim. In other words, people have some sort of natural lifespan. Of course, the lifespans here are very long. We didn't talk about that question in this class. And when we say someone God killed them, that's another way of saying he didn't live a natural death. Of course, God is responsible for nature also, but that's just how language works. And even in the Bible, that's how language works. And Kelukecha Esu Alihim could just mean he died young. He died before his time.